Oh,
Hello, hello.
Hi,
hello,
Rabbi.
Rabbi.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Hello, Rabbi.
Hi. So I just heard you were talking about key, the word key in Hebrew, right?
Right.
The word key can be translated as when, that, since, or because.
Wow.
There's a lot of English translations. In the context of the Torah portions, ki tetzei is when you will go out, and ki tavo is when you will come in. So that's what it means in that context.
Right. Thank you.
Today's lesson, welcome everyone. Hope you're doing well. Today's lesson on the portion named Pinchas is called Gatekeepers of the Torah. We're going to talk about Torah in general and things that some very important ideas. And then I have to warn you that it's also going to get a little bit technical. We're going to get a little Talmudic today with lots of questions and hopefully some answers too. So as a general introduction, we've mentioned this point before, but I think it's important to mention again. When we read the Torah is not a history book. In fact, if it was a history book, there would be a lot of missing pieces. There would be a lot of missing decades and sometimes even longer periods that are not included in the narrative. We have, of course, parts of Torah called midrash, which are filling in the gaps. So let's say there's plenty of stories of background information in the midrash that is not included in the written Torah, in the text of the 5 books of Moses. So in a broader sense, when we use the term Torah, we're talking about everything written, oral, midrash, Talmud, etc. But in a more narrow sense, when we talk about Torah, when we talk about the 5 books of Moses, the written law is very, very precise and is meant to be a life lesson, an instruction manual for all times, Jews in every era, in every place, in every generation. What does that mean? What that means is that if a story is mentioned in the Torah, then there is relevance in that story for all of us, even today. The Torah is communicating God's values, God's desires, God's will and wisdom. Of course, it's mentioned in the form of stories, but why choose this story over that story? Why is this story relevant and included in the text, and the other story is only in the midrash? And the answer is, if a story is included in the actual written Torah in the 5 books of Moses, that story must have eternal relevance for all Jews in all places and all times. Now, the problem is, that's a nice concept. The problem is like this. If you read the Torah, there are certain parts that seem to be only specific, applying to specific people in specific times and specific places. Some segments of Torah are relevant only when the Jewish people had a temple in Jerusalem, for example. There are many commandments that are not practical today because we do not have a temple. There were other parts of the Torah that even when we had a temple, and we're bringing offerings, animal offerings or incense offerings or other types of offerings on the altar, there were instructions there that were meant and designed for the Kohen, for the priests. So how could you say that every part of Torah is relevant to every single person? Does the Torah belong to all of us? Is it our collective heritage? Or in a larger question, in a larger context, we could even ask the question, we always say that the Torah is what unites Jews across cultures, across time zones, across generations, eras. And so what connects me today in Philadelphia to a Jew living in the 10th century in some other part of the world? The real connection that we have is the Torah, right? That's what binds us together. So if that's the case, why are there parts of the Torah that seem to be very limited and only geared to specific people at specific times? Is that supposed to be a uniting element of the Torah? Or by saying that this law is relevant for a Kohen and can only be performed in Israel when the temple is standing, does that perhaps compartmentalize us into different segments of Jews? So that's kind of like an overarching question that we want to address. And in order to do that, we're going to get specific into certain laws that are mentioned in this week's Torah reading. So you ready to go for it? Yeah? Okay, let's get into it. So the name Pinchas, the portion Pinchas, talks about an individual who was the grandson of Aaron, and he was somebody that protected with vigilance the sanctity of the Torah and its laws. We're not going to talk about him as a personality today, even though the name of the portion is, it's named after him. But we're going to talk about a section that talks about the festivals, the various Jewish holidays. There's a whole section that we read about which discusses the offerings in the temple. Now, there were daily offerings every morning and every evening or afternoon. There was a communal offering brought in the temple. And when it was Shabbat, there was an additional offering called the Musaf offering. When it was the beginning of the new month, Rosh Chodesh, there was also the Musaf additional offering. And then every festival had its own special offering. So today, when we have prayers substituting the offerings in the temple, those prayers that we say in our liturgy, in our services, are a parallel of the various sacrifices and offerings that were brought in the temple. Okay, so let's start off with one example of the festival offerings, the one that was meant to be offered on Rosh Hashanah. Says the Torah in the book of Numbers, beginning of chapter 29. The first day of the 7th month should be a holy occasion for you. Do not perform works of labor. It should be a day of shofar calling. So that's pretty much how we observe the day. It's a sacred day. We don't engage in mundane work. And on the positive sense, we sound the ram's horn, we sound the shofar. Now, in the temple, how do we observe Rosh Hashanah? There's a special offering. You should bring a burnt offering as a pleasing satisfaction for God, 1 young bull, 1 ram, and 7 lambs in their first year. So now we shift to the unique offering that is brought in the temple on Rosh Hashanah. And if you are familiar with the services in the synagogue, you know that the maftir reading, the very last reading of the Torah, will often be, if it's a festival, it will often be the passage from this week's Torah reading that mentions the various offerings particular to that festival. So many of the maftir readings for the festivals come from this week's portion, where we mention the various offerings specific to that festival. Now, after the Torah goes through all the various festivals and tells us what are the offerings for those specific days, there's a one-line verse, chapter 30, verse 1, where the Torah says the following words: "And Moses spoke to the children of Israel of all that God had instructed him." Now, that shouldn't come as a surprise that if God communicates a message to Moses, he will then relay it to the people. It's kind of obvious, right? There are many occasions where the Torah tells us that God spoke to Moses to relay information. Sometimes the Torah will describe the conversation as it was between God and Moses. Other times, the Torah will tell us the conversation between Moses and the Jewish people. But very rarely does the Torah explicitly state both sides of the conversation, that God spoke to Moses and Moses spoke to the people. If the Torah does mention both sides of the conversation, the fact that God spoke to Moses and Moses spoke to the children of Israel, there's a reason for it. Everything in Torah is precise. There are no extra words, no extra ink spilled. So if something is seemingly redundant, we have to ask, what is it teaching us? What is the lesson here? So here we don't just have an extra letter or an extra word. We have an entire extra verse, a whole passage, which seems to be very redundant. We know that if God spoke to Moses and it commanded him about the festivals and their appropriate offerings, then obviously Moses would instruct the Jewish people and relay that information. What lesson is there in this extra verse, the seemingly extra verse? Okay.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I was just going to say, it was just maybe the point of repeating it is that to show how important it was, that God didn't just tell Moses, Moses told the children of Israel, and it was really important that he said, that it was an emphasis, I guess.
Okay. So that's a great point. Thank you, Rachel, and welcome, Tova. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
So there's a point. There are sometimes words like double phrases that are mentioned for emphasis, but here we have an entire extra verse which is telling us something very obvious, something that we know from other places, that if God speaks to Moses, then Moses communicates to the Jewish people, and that information gets relayed. That's something that happens all the time, and yet the Torah doesn't mention that all the time. So why specifically here does the Torah choose to mention something very obvious when there's nothing extra in the Torah? So we're going to go back. We're going to rewind a little bit. We're now in the book of Numbers, Bamidbar. If you go back one book to the book of Leviticus, you'll see that there's another passage, another section of the Torah that also discusses the festivals, and that is in the portion called Emor. And this next verse from Leviticus tells us, something very similar to what we already just learned. The first day of the 7th month should be a day of rest, a memory of Israel through shofar sounding, a holy occasion. Do not perform any works of labor and bring a fire offering to God. Which holiday are we talking about?
Rosh Hashanah.
Rosh Hashanah. Now, although there's overlap between the verse in Numbers and the verse in Leviticus, the gist of the difference is that in Numbers, we are describing the offerings. Specifically, the focus is the offerings that are brought in the temple on this particular festival. And in passing, we'll mention the sanctity of the day. Whereas in Leviticus, it's just the opposite. We mention the offering just in passing, but the main focus is on how we observe the day of Rosh Hashanah. Now, who had to know about the offerings in the temple? It was information that was necessary for the Kohanim. There was that the tribe of Levi was split into Kohen and Levis, two kinds of, they each had specific roles in the temple. The Kohanim, the priests, were the ones who brought the sacrifices on the altar. They were the ones that brought the offerings. So any specific information about the offerings had to be communicated to who? To the Kohanim. Of course, when it comes to observing the day as a sacred day, Rosh Hashanah in general, the fact that we observe it as a day of rest, we don't work, we blow the shofar, that is information that everyone needs to know. All Jews need to know that information, right? So in the Talmud, often you find a whole discussion about analyzing a verse. What would we have thought if not for this verse? We would have thought X. Now that the Torah mentions this verse, we understand why. So if the Torah would not have relayed this in two separate occasions, right, we might have thought that Moses would relay the offering details just to the Kohanim because it was relevant for them. And the other parts of observance, how observe the festival in general, which is relevant to all Jews, he would communicate to all Jews. In order to, yes, Jerry.
You say the first part just related to the Kohanim, but don't the regular people bring the sacrifices to the Kohanim? The Kohanim might perform it, but somebody has to bring the animal. So
Okay, great question.
Everybody has to be qualified?
So let me clarify. There are two types of offerings in the temple. There are individual offerings and communal offerings. An individual offering, you're absolutely correct. Anyone could bring an animal and they would bring that to the Kohen. The Kohen would offer it on your behalf. When we talk about the festival offerings or the daily offerings or the Shabbat offerings, those were communal offerings. Those were not brought by individuals. There was one offering brought for the entire nation, and the Kohanim were the ones given the responsibility of bringing those to the temple. So here, in the context of the festivals, we're specifically talking about communal offerings, which was really not something that anyone else, if you were not a Kohen, you were not involved in that element, in that particular service. It's actually interesting that you mentioned that, because today, there's a certain advantage we have with the prayers. Today, on Rosh Hashanah, for example, when we pray, and we study the laws of the sacrifices, the offerings, are specific to Rosh Hashanah, and we mention them in our prayers, it's relevant for all people. So in other words, even though, so back in the temple days, the Rosh Hashanah service or the Yom Kippur service was performed by only Kohanim. So the rest of the people didn't really have a part in that service. So you might say there's a little bit of an advantage that we have today in that we have a part in bringing the manifestation of godliness into the physical space in our world that is accomplished through the act of offering an animal on the altar, which back then was something only a Kohen could perform. And today, in a certain sense, we can all practice that through our prayers and through our Torah study. So we'll mention that, we'll get back to that a little bit later, that concept. But back to our question. So we said, without this extra verse, without this extra mention, like we said before, there's a mention of Rosh Hashanah both in Leviticus as well as Numbers. So we might think that the offering section in our portion of Pinchas, of Numbers, Moses would have conveyed that only to the Kohanim because it was only relevant to them in a practical sense. And to dispel that notion, the Torah makes sure to emphasize this verse. No, you should know that Moses spoke to the children of Israel of all that God had instructed him. It's something that Moses gave to all the Jewish people, not just the Kohanim. Are you with me so far?
Yeah.
Okay. I want you to tell me when you lose me. Okay. So far, so good? Okay.
Yes.
Now there's an obvious question. The obvious question is, how could we have even thought? How would we even assume that Moses would relay certain parts of the Torah only to the Kohanim and not to everyone else, if the Torah clearly introduces this passage with the following phrase? It says, God spoke to Moses saying, instruct the children of Israel and say to them, here's the laws of the offerings. In other words, these very verses that were describing the laws of the offerings begin with an instruction to Moses to relay this information to the children of Israel. So it's quite obvious that if God's telling him to instruct the children of Israel, he's going to follow instructions. Moses doesn't just, do his own thing. Moses follows instructions. But the larger question is, why indeed would Moses need to share these laws with the entire nation? In other words, why would God want Moses to have to instruct these laws to all the people if it wasn't relevant for them? If you were not a Kohen serving in the temple, you didn't need to know the particular details of the offerings and what type of lamb you have to bring on the altar. So why is God saying to Moses, I want you to instruct the children of Israel about all these laws of the offerings? Wouldn't it make more sense to share this information with the Kohanim alone? Yes, Emily.
Was it in anticipation of a time when we wouldn't have a temple and we wouldn't be able to have the Kohanim do this for us?
Brilliant. You're alluding to our answer. We'll get there.
Really?
That's definitely part of the answer.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay, so before we get to the answer and elaborating on what Emily suggested here, I want to just review the question. So the question that we're asking is, why would Moses only convey to the Kohanim, to the priests, if God told him to tell everyone? In other words, we wouldn't even think that. And the larger question that we asked was, should all the Jews hear about the laws of priestly offerings if it's not information that's relevant for them personally? Okay.
Why is it even a question if Hashem says to tell the Jewish people? Then obviously he thinks it's relevant.
Right. So what we're trying to understand, we could accept it on faith that if God says so, it must be relevant. But we're trying to understand as much as possible. In other words, there's parts of Torah that like we spoke about the other week. We spoke about the red heifer. There's parts of Torah that are beyond our understanding and comprehension. But this is not something that is seemingly a part of Torah that is beyond our comprehension. So we're trying to understand, to the best of our ability, the reason, the rationale for why would God want all Jews to know the details of the laws that are not relevant for all Jews.
Rabbi, maybe he meant, I'm sorry, maybe the point is that he wanted the people to know what the Kohanim were doing, the priests were doing, rather than just have them, do these things and the people thinking like, well, what's going on?
Okay, so you're saying for informational purposes, just
Yeah.
so that they should be in the loop, they should know exactly what's going on in the temple. It shouldn't be a secret.
So people are, people might see things going on and they're like, why are they doing this? What's the what's the point of this? And
Okay.
so Moses is being instructed to tell them, so people aren't just sitting, watching this like watching a show, so to speak. They're understanding what's going on, what the priests are doing.
Okay,
than
very
just
good.
making them-
That's a great possible answer. Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, that resonates for me because it teaches a lesson when you do something on behalf of the community. You should be transparent about what it is that's being done so they all feel more connected to it.
Very good, Eugene. So we find this concept of transparency a lot, especially when they were collecting money. Like there were collections for the communal offerings. Every person had to give a certain amount, and the Torah makes sure to detail the accounting of the collections, and it shows us the obligation on leaders to be transparent. So now we're suggesting perhaps that this information is necessary for all the Jews to know, so they shouldn't think that, oh, the Kohanim get, certain privileged information that is not available for everyone else. We're even though the Kohanim are the ones designated to perform the actual offerings in the temple and to walk up the altar and bring the offering to God, but all Jews are participating. They're simply representing us. They're doing it on our behalf. We should know the details of what's going on there.
Right.
Okay, very good. Thank you for sharing that. Before we get to elaborating the answer, we have some more questions here. A lot of questions. First of all, one question is, why would these two parts be mentioned in two separate books, one in Leviticus and one in Numbers? If they're both about the festivals, why not present them together, consolidated? Number two, when was the book of Leviticus transmitted to the Jewish people? In the very beginning of the 40 years in the desert. So in the very first year that the Jewish people were in the desert, they built the Mishkan. They built this tabernacle, which is like the portable temple, and they carried it with them wherever they went. Now, one of the main features of the Mishkan was bringing offerings, right? So the book of Leviticus describes the early part of the 40-year journey. The book of Numbers primarily happens in the 40th year, in the final year of Moshe's life, and it's the final year of their 40 journey in the desert. Here's a very, very obvious question. If God wanted the festivals to be observed, one of the ways that we observe the festivals is by bringing certain offerings in the temple. Why would he wait 39 years to communicate the laws of the offerings? Surely, if the Mishkan was built in year one, they needed to have that information of the details of the offerings in year one. So certainly it wouldn't have made sense to wait 39 years until the 40th year to communicate information that they needed to have 40 years ago.
Well, maybe it was to reinforce now that you're enter the land of Israel. Remember what I told you when we first started out on this journey? Well, now you're getting ready to enter the land of Israel. So I just want to remind you, in case you forgot, I mean, 40 years is a long time. You're entering the land of Israel, Eretz Israel, and just remind you that this is what I told
Rachel,
you.
It's a great point. We actually have the final book of the Torah, the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, is a review of the first four books. So at the very end of Moshe's life, he does recap everything that happened over the 40 years as a preparation, just like you said, as a preparation for entering the promised land. Here, let's summarize everything we did and we spoke about over these past 40 years. And that happens in the fifth book. But now the question is about the fourth book, right? If there's relevant laws regarding the offerings in the temple, that information clearly should have been communicated earlier on in the first year, as soon as the Mishkan was established. So surely throughout the 40 years, they brought sacrifices, they brought offerings in the temple. So this was not new information. So maybe you want to say, you might be able to answer that perhaps 39 years earlier, Moses communicated them only to the Kohanim because they were the ones that needed to know that information. And then God decided, you know what, now it's time for everyone to know this. So in the final year of his life, he tells them, instruct the Jewish people, instruct the children of Israel with these laws.
Right.
Now, we know, again, another very important principle in the Torah when studying Torah. Principle number one that we mentioned before is that if a story or a law or anything in the narrative of the 5 books of Moses is written in the text itself, it's eternally relevant for all information. We mentioned that in the beginning. The second important principle that we have to remember is that the Torah is not written in chronological order. So sometimes we will have events the Rashi says in the Talmud, the Torah is not particular about the chronological order of events. You'll have events that are recorded earlier in the Torah. They are sometimes preceded by events that are recorded later. So obviously, we're not going to have the wrong dates. If something happened at a certain time, the Torah will communicate that clearly. But an event that happened in the second month of their leaving Egypt could very well be mentioned before an event that happened in the first month. Now, let's understand this. There's a 16th century rabbi known as Rabbi Horowitz the Shalah, who was a rabbi in Prague and in Frankfurt, and he mentions in his commentary about this very point. He says as follows. Let's read it together. Text 5. The Torah is in perfect order, not only from the mystical perspective in which the Torah is a series of divine names and is arranged according to the order of these names, but also from a simple perspective. There's always a reason for the order in which the Torah is arranged. Never suppose that the Torah is out of order and that certain chapters should have appeared before or after other chapters. Rather, everything is with perfect reason and is arranged in proper order. What is he saying? He's basically saying that even though they may be out of sequence in chronological order, but everything in the Torah is in the right, in perfect conceptual order. So if it was a history book, if the Torah was simply communicating, this is what happened in the first year, this is what happened the second year, and it was going through history, it would want to preserve the chronological order. Since it's not a book of history, since the Torah is a book of teaching for all times, when you teach a student, you want to ensure that it's more important to ensure that something is in conceptual order than in chronological order. So the Torah's main objective is to communicate ideas, laws, thoughts with precision, with clarity. And if we have to compromise the timeline to go out of chronological order, we'll pay that price, because it's more important to be precise with the concepts.
Rabbi, I have a question or two.
Yes.
At Mount Sinai, how much of the written Torah was given to Moses, and how much of the oral Torah was given to Moses? And what about the rest of the written Torah and the oral Torah? Were they given over periods of time at different times?
Briefly, what happened at Sinai is that the entire nation received the 10 commandments. Moses then goes up the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, and he gets the rest of the Torah. All the other parts of Torah are communicated to Moses up individually on the mountain.
The written Torah?
Both written and oral. He's given everything.
So then Moses knows what's going to happen.
So there's a difference between the laws and the narrative. He's given all the laws of the Torah, right? But then the narrative unfolds as they're going through the 40-year journey in the desert. So obviously those parts weren't written before they actually happened, right? As they happened, they were dictated by God to Moses, and he wrote them down. So back to our original question. Why does the Torah find it necessary to tell us that Moses communicated the laws of the offerings to the entire people? We now know that the Torah mentions the laws of the festivals twice. One, how to practice the festival, how to observe Rosh Hashanah and blow the shofar and make it as a sacred day of rest. And two, how to bring the offerings on Rosh Hashanah, right? Now that we know that the Torah's timeline the Torah is not so precise with the timeline, we understand why it was necessary for the Torah to add that extra verse. If the Torah did not tell us that Moses conveyed the laws of sacrifices to the entire nation, we would suggest that the two presentations were given to Moses at the same time, and would make more sense logically. And we would say, you know what, the reason why the Torah mentions one in Leviticus And the second in the book of Numbers is because, like we always say, it's not in chronological order. It's an imprecise timeline, but they were conveyed together. But how would we understand the opening line where God says, "Speak to the children of Israel," which instructs Moses to clearly communicate the laws of the offerings to all Jews? So we would say that when God presented this law to Moses, first came the laws of the offerings, and then came the laws of the festival practices, even though the Torah mentions it in reverse order. But because we know there's an imprecise timeline here, we would be able to argue that "Speak to the children of Israel" is more like a general introduction to both presentations. But God never intended for the entire presentation to be conveyed to the entire nation. The parts that were relevant to the Kohanim were meant for them, and the parts relevant to the people were meant for them. In other words, we would say that there wasn't a 39-year gap between the sacrifices and the details of the offerings and the festival observances, but rather they came together. So there's another rule that we only talk about this chronological imprecision, the fact that it's not in chronological order, when it's necessary. If we can assume that the chronological order is precise, right, then we assume that it is. So the suggestion that God gave the Jewish people a Mishkan in the first year, but waited 39 years to then communicate the laws, the details of the offerings, doesn't fit well with our rationale, because certainly God would have given them when they were necessary earlier, and Moses must have conveyed them to the Kohanim earlier. And the fact that the Torah doesn't record that at the time back in Leviticus is not unusual, because most of the Torah's laws were communicated orally to Moses. This could have been one of those oral teachings. So then the question is, why would he have then repeat that 39 years later? So he says as follows. Text 7. The Torah portion adds a new wrinkle. Instruct the children of Israel and say to them. God instructs all Jews to ensure that these offerings are brought at the right time. However, the details and the rules had already been presented to Moses 40 years earlier, and he had conveyed them to the priests who are responsible for the offerings. So the first time, what we're saying is that the first time, Moses conveyed the information to the Kohanim because they needed to know this information. Now, at this point, 39 years later, Moses is instructed to convey this to all the people. The Torah doesn't have to convey the instruction twice. The fact that the Torah does mention it twice is significant. So, number one, as Emily mentioned earlier, there's an idea that even though a particular law or a particular mitzvah does not have practical relevance to all Jews, it still has spiritual relevance to all Jews. So in other words, the idea that all Jews have a connection to these offerings and what they're meant to accomplish extends to all future generations. It wasn't just that one-time generation in the desert. In fact, there's a lot of one-time things that happened in the desert that the Torah does not include in the narrative because it was only one time. It's not relevant to us. And we said the rule is that if it's mentioned in the Torah, it has to be eternally relevant for all time. So the idea, the spiritual concept of a sacrifice is meant to inspire and motivate us to connect to God. The Hebrew word for offering is karban, which means to come close. When we come close to God, even though the Kohanim were the ones to actually perform the sacrificial rites in the practical sense, but in the spiritual sense, it was relevant for all Jews. And therefore, before Moses passes away, God wants him to give the people like a final pep talk to remain devoted to God. Remember, this is what it's all about. Even though you're not a Kohen and you're not the one standing on the altar bringing the offering, the Kohanim are representing you, but make sure that the spiritual idea of what an offering accomplishes, coming close to God, offering your heart and soul and commitment to God through the means of an offering, is something that you continue to take note of. So what we're saying is that when we study Torah, and when we study specifically the laws of offerings, we are connecting with God. In a certain sense, every single part of Torah connects us to God and affects our behavior. Not only those parts of Torah which have practical relevance, but when we study the law, and the only purpose of this law is to absorb the divine wisdom, then we have a pure connection to the divine. So I want to just elaborate on this a little bit in terms of, to contrast this with secular law. In the United States, or any country for that matter, there's no expectation that every American knows every law. If you have a question in a particular area of law, you go to a professional, you go to an expert. So if you have a tax question, you go to a tax attorney, and you go to a legal expert who specializes in particular area of law, right?
Hello.
So there's no idea, there's no concept that by studying the law itself, I'm building a relationship with the founding fathers or the legislators of the laws, right? I need to know the laws for practical reasons. When a person violates the law and gets arrested and charged, they have to hire an attorney to argue the case based on the statutes and the laws that they are knowledgeable about. Otherwise, I don't need to know this law. It's irrelevant information for me. So when it comes to American law, it's not necessary for every American to know every law. That's why we have legal scholars who have their expertise in particular areas of law. When it comes to Torah, Torah is not just a set of laws. Torah is divine wisdom. And when we study the Torah, we are getting insight into the will and wisdom and the values and the desires of God Almighty. So it's not just about knowing the laws for their practical relevance. It's also the very fact that we're studying laws of Torah. If it's Torah, it's divine wisdom and it connects us to God. And therefore, yes, we do want to enhance and strengthen our relationship with God. And that's why we study Torah. So, prior to Moshe's passing, God wanted him to give the people a final pep talk. Yes, the Kohanim, the priests, are the ones who are offering the sacrifices physically on God's altar. But at the same time, all Jews practice spiritually, committing their minds and hearts. And therefore, this is information that is relevant for all people, not just of that generation, but for all future generations. What about today, when we don't have a temple? So the Midrash teaches, forgive all sin, teach us goodness, and let our lips replace the bull offerings. The Jewish people said to God, Master of the universe, when the temple stood, we would offer a sacrifice and be forgiven. Now that the temple is destroyed, all we can do is pray. So we look to the Talmud, where Reish Lakish said, what is the meaning of the verse? Where the Torah says, this is the Torah for the burnt offering, the meal offering, the sin offering, the guilt offering. It teaches us that one who studies Torah is deemed to have brought a burnt offering, a meal offering, a sin offering, a guilt offering. So Torah study can be a substitute for, if you study the laws of that particular offering, it's considered as if you brought it on the altar. Another midrash, one day Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai left Jerusalem, followed by Rabbi Yeshua, and they saw the temple lying in ruins. Rabbi Yeshua moaned, woe unto us that the place of Israel's expiation lies in ruins. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai replied, my son, do not be distraught. An equivalent expiation remains to us. What is it? The mitzvah to bestow kindness. So we just read 3 different ways that we today can continue the spiritual attachment to God that was made possible in those days only with offerings. One is through prayer. The second is through Torah study, specifically the laws of those offerings. And 3, the practice of kindness and good deeds. Just like in those days, it enabled a person to come close to God and to connect to God. That was when the temple stood. Today, that opportunity is given to each of us. And that is why Moses needed to share these laws with all Jews. It wasn't enough to just teach them to the Kohanim. And that's also why God waited until the final year of Moshe's life to teach these laws to the Jewish people, because as long as they had the Mishkan, as long as they had the altar and the temple stood, it wouldn't be necessary to talk about the spiritual component. Years later, when they didn't have the temple, and they would be now faced with a time of exile, they would have the spiritual component of the sacrifices, which was available to them. So we said that prayer, Torah study, and good deeds bring us as close to God as the offerings did when the temple stood. And now that they were ending their time in the desert, God waited until Moshe's final year to offer these teachings, not just to the Kohanim, who obviously had it before, but now the rest of the people were given the insight into these laws. Okay. A final teaching from the Rebbe. God asks us daily to study the laws of the sacrifices. While we are in exile, driven from our father's table, God makes his request softly. He uses the term vayomer instead of vayadaber, which is a softer term. a Jew can argue that if God wants us to offer sacrifices, we're willing. Let God provide the temple, the priesthood, and we'll offer sacrifices. If he's not prepared to do what we ask, we're not prepared to do as he asks. He took it away from us, our priests, our purity, and our temple. If he wants us to offer sacrifices, let him return them. Therefore, the term that the Torah chooses to use is not vayedaber, the normal term, which is kind of speaking harshly, but rather vayomer, where he speaks softly. In a certain sense, it's almost like God begs and pleads that we study the Torah laws about the sacrifices, even though we don't have the opportunity to bring offerings on the temple in the literal sense, in a practical way. And then if we do, we are promised that the third temple, which will be everlasting, will indeed be rebuilt. Our final redemption will be at hand with Mashiach. Our righteous Redeemer will arrive imminently to redeem us and to lead us with pride. So in other words, in a time of exile, in a time when we don't have a temple, and we're not able to bring these offerings in the temple, we might feel like something is deprived, we're deprived of this opportunity. And yet God is sensitive to these feelings and therefore tries to ask us in a pleading way, in a soft way, to continue studying these laws, even though they may sound abstract and theoretical and not practical to our lives, because it helps to appreciate that this connection, this relationship that each of us has with God remains strong even in a time of exile, even in a time of galus. So because we're in a relationship with God, we'll do what he asks us to do. We'll do our part. At the same time, we continue to hope and pray to God that he allow us to have the opportunity to have the full experience, to be able to perform mitzvot and Torah study and study Torah in the fullest sense of the word, not just to have the spiritual component as we do today, but also to be able to have the practical physical component, which will only be possible when the third temple is rebuilt and when Mashiach comes. So by our studying these laws, the laws of the temple, the laws of the offerings in the temple, in a certain sense, it's hastening the time that God listens to our prayers and brings us the final redemption, brings us the coming of Mashiach, when there will be the opportunity to connect with God in that complete way. Yes, Emily.
And then once the third temple is built, we'll still know what to do. We'll remember.
We'll still know what to do.
Yeah. Since
Oh,
all
you're saying because we're studying these laws, we'll have all the information we need to get straight into it.
Also that we'll know what to do for temple sacrifices. It's been so long since we had a temple, it could easily be forgotten, but that it's still being taught and studied. Once the temple is built, we'll still know what to do in it.
Very good, very good. So this information has been preserved over close to 2,000 years. When we haven't had a temple, we've continued to study the laws. We know what the temple is how this temple is supposed to look, how it's supposed to work, and all the relevant laws. We'll have that because we never gave up on the temple being rebuilt. And therefore, God is pleading with us that even during this time of exile, when we have a challenging relationship with God, because he conceals his presence from us, and we don't have an open relationship with a temple and open miracles, still, if we do our part, we are inspired to do what God asks of us, and we know that God will be inspired to give us what we need and send us Mashiach and the third temple, which will be rebuilt speedily. Amen. So that is the thought for the week. Again, the concept that all parts of Torah belong to each of us equally. We have, no matter whether we are a Kohen or not, whatever type of Jew we are, and whatever time or era we live in, there's a message and a practical relevance to every single part of Torah. Obviously, certain parts of Torah we have to delve a little bit deeper to explore that relevance. But once we do, we can find the message and inspiration for our lives today. So that we're going to end here, unless there's any final questions.
I was just wondering if we can think about the people in Florida and the Pacific Northwest as they're suffering in the heat, and in Florida that many people have been lost and hopefully will
Yes,
be found.
Yes. Well, again, we know that part of the symptoms of exile, sometimes when people are comfortable and everything is going right, we forget that we're in exile. And lately we've been having too many reminders that the world is not the way it's meant to be. Things are broken, people are suffering, people are in pain. And we pray to God, we ask God every single day to repair the world, to bring the world back to the way it's meant to be, where there's no more suffering, no more illness, even death will be abolished in the future era of Mashiach, and we'll have peace on earth and all the blessings in a revealed sense. So may we all do our part to try to alleviate some of that suffering even today as best as we can. In our own small way, we can bring healing to others, to ourselves. And as we internalize this consciousness that we have in our relationship with God through our increased Torah study and the merit of our mitzvot, the way we perform the mitzvot, we bring more light into the world and automatically dispel the darkness and the negativity. I wish you a
Thank you.
wonderful week.
The same to
And
you.
God willing, see you next Thursday, same time, same place. Or
God
hopefully
willing.
we'll meet in the temple in Jerusalem before that.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.